Australia looks like a country, but underneath its sun-bleached surface, scattered across deserts and mountain ranges and forgotten coastlines, there are places where time stopped without warning. Towns that were alive and breathing one decade and hollow and silent the next. Streets that used to carry the noise of children and horses and machinery, now carrying nothing but wind. Some of these places were poisoned. Some were swallowed by water. Some were simply abandoned when the money ran out and the people walked away and nobody ever came back. A few are so remote that explorers still find furniture in the houses, plates on the tables, calendars frozen on dates decades old. This is not a list of charming heritage sites. This is 11 places where something went wrong, where the dream cracked and the desert moved in, where you can stand in the middle of a town that once held thousands of people and hear absolutely nothing. Welcome to the weirdest and creepiest abandoned towns in Australia. 11 places that Australia built, lived in, depended on, and then either walked away from or actively tried to erase. 11 places that are still out there, waiting for anyone willing to make the journey. Town number 1. Wittenoom, Western Australia. The town erased from the map. There is a town in the Pilbara region of Western Australia that the government officially refuses to acknowledge exists. You will not find it on most modern road maps. The state government removed it from official records in 2007. Road signs leading to it were taken down. The Postal Service stopped delivering there years earlier. For all bureaucratic purposes, Wittenoom does not exist. But it does exist, and the reason it was erased is one of the most disturbing stories in Australian history. Wittenoom was built in the 1940s to support the mining of blue asbestos, also known as chrysotylite, in the nearby gorge. Blue asbestos is the most dangerous form of the mineral. The fibers are incredibly fine and embed permanently in lung tissue. By the time symptoms appear, decades may have passed. By the time a diagnosis arrives, it is almost always too late. At its peak, in the 1950s, Wittenoom had a population of around 20,000 people. There were shops, a hospital, a swimming pool, a school. Children played in the tailings because it looked like fine pink sand. Workers went home covered in dust they did not know was quietly destroying them from the inside. The mill operated without proper safety controls. The air inside the processing plant was thick with invisible fibers. The mine closed in 1966. But people stayed. As the years passed, the deaths began. Former workers and residents were diagnosed with mesothelioma, asbestosis, and lung cancer at rates that shocked the medical community. Estimates suggest more than 2,000 people who lived or worked in Wittenoom have died from asbestos-related disease. That number is still rising. Today, fewer than 10 people officially remain. The government has tried to buy them out. Some refuse to leave. The town itself is crumbling back into the earth. The asbestos is still there, in the soil, in the air, when the wind blows. Scientists have measured fibers in the air around the old town site. There are no barriers stopping you from walking straight into what some researchers have called the most contaminated place in the southern hemisphere. The gorge is still beautiful. That is perhaps the strangest thing about Wittenoom. Red rocks and blue skies and ancient gorges carved over millions of years. And buried inside all of that beauty is a town that Australia officially wiped from its own records. Town number 2, Gwalia, Western Australia. The frozen town. In the Western Australian goldfields, roughly 720 kilometres northeast of Perth, there is a town where time stopped in the early 1960s and was never restarted. The houses still contain furniture. The kitchen shelves still hold old cans and bottles. The old hotel still has glasses on the bar. Gwalia was a gold mining town that boomed at the turn of the 20th century. The Sons of Gwalia mine was one of the most productive gold operations in Australia. At one point, its manager was a young American engineer named Herbert Hoover, who would later become the 31st President of the United States. That detail alone makes Gwalia strange enough, but what makes it genuinely unsettling is what happened when it closed. The mine struggled and closed in 1963. The remaining population left almost overnight. But unlike most abandoned towns where everything of value is stripped away, Gwalia was left almost entirely intact. Houses still had personal belongings inside. The Hoover House, where the future president once lived, still stood with period furniture. The Old State Hotel was preserved as if the last guests had simply stepped out and never came back. Walking through Gwalia means walking through a building that looks less like a museum and more like a crime scene where everyone vanished. There is a particular quality to stillness preserved for 60 years in a dry desert climate. It sits differently than ordinary quiet. It has weight. This was a town of real people. They ate at those tables and slept in those beds and walked those streets, and then they left. And the desert preserved what they left behind, and now strangers walk through it, taking photographs. Town number 3, Farina, South Australia. The underground town. Most ghost towns are on the surface. Farina is different. When the settlers ran out of timber in the unforgiving outback of South Australia, they went underground. The result is a town where the most intact structures are not the buildings above ground, but the rooms and chambers carved into the earth below. Farina was established in 1878, built on the assumption that reliable rainfall would eventually come. The name comes from the Latin word for flower, chosen in the optimistic belief that the town would become an agricultural hub. That optimism was misplaced. The rainfall never arrived consistently. The farming failed. The railway bypassed the region. By the 1940s, Farina was finished. What makes Farina strange is the underground bakery. Cut directly into soft sandstone, it was built below ground level to use the Earth's natural insulation against brutal desert heat. The underground chamber maintained a more stable temperature than anything constructed above the surface. The ovens are still there. The stone walls still carry decades of baking stains. You can walk into a room dug out of the earth in the 1880s and stand in near darkness and understand exactly what it felt like to survive out here by going underground. Restoration volunteers have been working on Farina for years. Stone buildings have been partially stabilized and documented, but the majority of the townsite is still ruins. Stone walls standing at strange half heights where they collapsed. Doorways that open onto nothing. The ground between the structures is scattered with broken glass and rusted iron, and the fragments of a life that ended before anyone thought to record it properly. The old cemetery sits outside of town, its graves marked with wooden crosses, bleached almost white by the sun. The silence in Farina is the particular silence of the outback, which is not truly silence, but the sound of heat pressing down on dry earth from an enormous distance. Town number 4, Silverton, New South Wales. The town that became a film set. There is a town in the far west of New South Wales, about 25 kilometres from Broken Hill, that has had a stranger second life than almost any other abandoned settlement in Australia. Silverton was a silver mining town that boomed in the 1880s and nearly collapsed within a decade when the mining companies relocated to Broken Hill. By the early 20th century, Silverton was a ghost town with a permanent population shrunk to double digits. And then the filmmakers arrived. The landscape around Silverton is extraordinary. Red plains stretching to every horizon. Rock formations bleached by a sun that feels closer here than anywhere else. Mad Max 2 was filmed here in 1981. Priscilla, Queen of the Desert was filmed here in 1994. Numerous car commercials and television series have used Silverton's empty streets as backdrop. The contradiction at the center of Silverton is what makes it genuinely strange. This is a town that died because there was nothing here, and now it exists precisely because there is nothing here. The emptiness became its greatest asset. The absence became its identity. Visitors come to experience a place most famous for being abandoned, where the main attraction is the feeling of standing in a landscape so empty it seems to belong to another planet. The old jail still stands. The ruins of the original town are scattered across the red earth, and on most days, the only sounds are the wind and the flies, and the occasional tourist car pulling into the dirt car park of the pub that somehow still operates here. Town number 5, Old Adaminaby, New South Wales, the town beneath the water. In times of severe drought, when the water level in Lake Yucumbene in the Snowy Mountains drops far below its normal surface, something rises from the depths. Streets appear. The stumps of old buildings become visible. Fence posts emerge in rows, marking property boundaries from another era. Old Adaminaby, the township deliberately flooded to create the reservoir in 1958, comes back. The flooding was a planned act. The Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme required the creation of Lake Yucumbene, and the valley where Adaminaby stood was the right valley. The residents were relocated to a new town built a few kilometers away. They took what they could carry. The buildings were cleared before the waters rose, but the infrastructure remained, and the bones of the original settlement are still down there. What makes old Adaminaby unsettling is what happens when it surfaces. Drought conditions have caused the lake to drop significantly on multiple occasions, and each time the ghost of the old town emerges, visitors come to walk submerged streets, to stand on what used to be a footpath and look at fence lines and the shapes of old foundations. The lake covers a massive area. On most days, it looks perfectly ordinary, a beautiful mountain reservoir surrounded by eucalypts. But somewhere under that surface, there are streets with names. There are addresses where families once lived, corners where children once played, now 20 meters below the waterline, preserved in cold, dark water. Town number 6, Cossack, Western Australia. The Purling Ghost Town. On the coast of the Pilbara, at the mouth of the Harding River, there is a town made of stone that has not been properly inhabited in over a century. Cossack was once the most important port in the northwest of Australia. Pearling fleets operated from here. The buildings that remain are substantial stone structures built to last, which is why they are still standing, which is why Cossack looks less like a ruin and more like a town that everyone simply walked out of. The pearling industry relied on divers brought from Japan, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. The conditions were dangerous. Divers descended without modern equipment into waters where cyclones and sharks were routine hazards. The death rate was appalling. The cemetery at Cossack contains graves from many nationalities, a record of the extraordinary human cost of the industry that built this place. The town was finished as a functioning port by the early 20th century. The harbour silted up. Commerce moved away. Today it is a collection of beautiful, empty stone buildings standing in scrubland on a coast that feels genuinely remote, even by Western Australian standards. When the day visitors leave and the light goes flat and the wind comes off the water, Cossack settles into a quiet that feels earned. Earned by the divers who died bringing up shells, by the workers who built those stone walls in 40-degree heat, by all the people who came to the edge of Australia and built something and then left it behind. Town number 7, Arltunga, Northern Territory. The Desert Gold Fever Town. In the eastern MacDonnell Ranges of the Northern Territory, roughly 110 kilometres east of Alice Springs, the ruins of Australia's first legally gazetted gold town sit in a desert landscape so harsh, it is difficult to understand how anyone lived here at all. Arltunga was established in 1887 after gold was discovered in the region. Prospectors came from across Australia, many walking hundreds of kilometres through desert to reach a goldfield that turned out to be far less productive than the rumours suggested. Water had to be carted from great distances. Food was prohibitively costly to transport. Temperatures in summer regularly exceeded 45 degrees. The gold required complex processing to extract, and the returns often did not justify the investment. By the mid-20th century, Arltunga was declining. The Government Assayer's Office closed in 1912. The last mine closed in the 1940s. What remained were stone buildings, dry stone walls, and the cemetery. The cemetery at Arltunga is one of the most affecting places in the Northern Territory. The graves are marked mostly with simple wooden crosses and handmade markers. Many record deaths from disease and heat exhaustion. Some record ages that are shocking to read. 23 years old, 31 years old. People who walked into the desert following the promise of gold and died there. The isolation that killed them is still present. You can feel it standing in that cemetery with the ranges rising behind you and nothing but spinifex stretching in every direction. Town number 8, Yerranderie, New South Wales, the private ghost town. Most abandoned towns on this list are accessible by ordinary means. Yerranderie is different. Situated in the southern Blue Mountains near the Natai National Park, it is accessible only by four-wheel drive via extremely rough tracks, or by light aircraft landing on the small dirt airstrip. This isolation is part of its identity and also the reason it has survived at all. Yerranderie was a silver mining town that peaked between 1,900 and 1,928. At its height, it had a population of around 2,000 people, complete with a post office, hospital, school, and hotels. When the silver price collapsed in the late 1920s, the town emptied rapidly. Yerranderie was then purchased by a private individual, which meant it was maintained over the decades rather than simply left to collapse. The result is a ghost town in unusually good condition. Buildings still have roofs. The old hotel is largely intact, but the isolation strips away any sense of ordinary heritage tourism. Getting here requires either a serious four-wheel drive expedition through mountain tracks that become impassable after rain, or the slightly surreal experience of landing on a dirt strip in a light plane and stepping out into a town of empty buildings surrounded by national park. There are very few places in Australia where you can stand in a genuine ghost town and understand, viscerally and completely, what it means to be somewhere the world left behind. Yerranderie is one of them. The mountains close around it. The nearest sealed road is hours away. The silence makes you aware of your own breathing. Town number 9, Ravenswood, Queensland. The town that never quite died. Ravenswood in northern Queensland is not completely abandoned. That is precisely what makes it strange. It occupies a middle ground. Most ghost towns do not. A place that is neither alive nor dead, containing both functioning residents and decades of crumbling ruins, with a population small enough to feel like a ghost town, but persistent enough to resist that classification entirely. The town was a significant gold mining centre in the 1870s and 1880s. At its peak, it had a population of several thousand people, and all the infrastructure that implied: banks, newspapers, hotels, churches. When the accessible gold ran out, Ravenswood entered a long, slow contraction. By mid-century, it was essentially a handful of residents surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a substantial town. What is left is genuinely eerie. The 2 remaining pubs are still operating. The Imperial Hotel has been listed as one of Australia's most historic pubs, but around these functioning buildings are the ruins of everything else. Stone walls at various stages of collapse, the old courthouse standing intact but empty, houses where the rooflines are gone and the rooms are open to the sky. Ravenswood challenges the usual narrative of abandonment because it refuses to be entirely abandoned. There are still people who live here and drink in those pubs who have chosen this life at the edge of a ghost town. What that says about the human instinct to stay in a place the rest of the world has moved past is something Ravenswood asks every single visitor to consider. Town number 10, Walhalla, Victoria, the mountain town and its vertical cemetery. In the mountains of Gippsland in Victoria, accessible by a road that winds through rainforest and follows a creek valley for the final kilometres, there is a town that should not have been built where it was built. Walhalla sits in a narrow valley. The long tunnel extended gold mine having produced significant wealth in the 1860s, but the geography forced the town to climb the steep valley walls in ways that now look almost impossible. Houses cling to slopes at angles that defy sensible construction. Gardens terrace up hillsides, so steep that maintaining them must have required extraordinary effort. But it is the cemetery that makes Walhalla truly memorable. The cemetery is on the side of a hill so steep that the graves are arranged in horizontal rows cut into the slope, each grave its own tiny terrace held against the gradient. Walking through it means climbing from level to level, stopping at each row to read names and dates on headstones tilted at various angles. Children who died in the 1870s, women who came from Ireland and England and Germany and never left. Men killed in mining accidents, recorded without particular ceremony, in the same rows as everyone else. The town itself has some operational elements and a small number of residents, but the feeling of Walhalla is of a place that persists against the logic of its location. The valley is too narrow, the slopes are too steep, the road in is too difficult. And yet here it is, and here its dead remain in their gravity-defying cemetery, and the rainforest is slowly taking back the slopes cleared to build it. Town number 11, Goldsworthy, Western Australia, the town that was deliberately demolished. The final entry is different from the others, because Goldsworthy is not abandoned in the traditional sense. It was not left behind when the money ran out. It was not evacuated due to disaster. Goldsworthy was deliberately, systematically demolished by the company that owned it, and the reason it was demolished, rather than simply abandoned, tells you something important about the relationship between corporations and the communities they create. Goldsworthy was built from scratch in the Pilbara in 1966 to service iron ore mining operations. It had houses, A school, a shopping centre, recreational facilities, an airstrip. At its peak, it housed over 1,000 people. The company, BHP, controlled the town entirely. When the accessible ore was exhausted in 1993, the company closed the mine and decommissioned the town. The residents were given relocation assistance. The buildings were bulldozed. The streets were cleared. What remained was carefully levelled ground in the Pilbara scrubland, with only the ghost of a street grid visible in the changed patterns of vegetation growth. What Goldsworthy makes visible is the truth that most of these towns share. They were never really built for the people who lived in them. They were built for the resource that lay underneath them. The people were secondary. The infrastructure was temporary. The town itself was always a means to an end. When the end arrived, the means was removed. There is something about standing on a patch of ground where 1,000 people once lived and finding nothing, not ruins, not walls, not graves, but simply nothing, that clarifies the relationship between human settlement and economic extraction in a way that no historical account can fully achieve. 11 towns, 11 different ways a place can end. And somewhere out there, in the desert and the mountains, and underneath reservoirs, and behind demolition fences, there are more of them. Places that do not appear on modern maps. Places where the silence has been accumulating for decades. Places where something went wrong, and the evidence has been slowly returning to Earth ever since. Australia is full of them. And most of them, nobody remembers anymore.